The Shroud of Turin is being deemed as, and I even agree with this too, the greatest discovery in humankind. But the Shroud of Turin is supposedly, and now being evidenced and being concluded as, the actual burial cloth of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now, what went viral was actually that they did an AI replacement video, or an AI negative video, I think, um, that used what was imprinted upon the cloth to recreate an AI image of what the individual would have looked like, oh, forgive me, with his face and I believe just his upper body. I think it might be his whole body, but the one I saw was just his head and his shoulders. And it is a spot on image of what we've seen in iconography since like all the way predating back to like, I think it's like, early days, like 890 AD, 1372 AD. And you can see all the different iconography of what Jesus was and how he's depicted is all very similar. It's one of these things that people kind of get irritated at because they're like, Jesus wasn't white. But even though everything else depicted in history from the beginning of the Roman Church even shows him to be like this. But let me go here. This is from Eric Siemens on Twitter. This is one of the larger ones that I saw it from. And this is the actual image that the AI recreated, I think with a few extra filters added on. But it is an amazing AI-generated image of Jesus Christ based on the authentic Shroud of Turin. Now, previously, the Shroud of Turin had been, supposedly debunked in some 1988 commission that was done in France, I believe, or whoever was currently holding on to wherever the cloth was residing. And they kind of chucked it up to being medieval forgery. Now, there's a lot of arguments against that. If you want hardcore evidence, I actually sent this clip to my father, I believe yesterday. Timotheeology, who is a Roman Catholic, had a great appearance on the Michael Knowles episode where he kind of ran through a bunch of the evidence that supports it while also downplaying what he said was a conspiracy in that 1988 report. And so this tweet goes on to say, it's a good reminder of the fact that God became a particular man at a particular moment in history. This is no myth. We worship the God who became one of us. Now, I will go to this clip here. This is from Michael Knowles, and it's about 8 minutes long, so I wanted to save it for the end for people who would be truly interested in it. And so this is him saying a new study is done on the Shroud of Turin has found that the purported burial cloth is 2,000 years old, which actually lines up with the crucifixion of Jesus, rather than the several hundred years old, which came from that 1988 report, which said actually this is just some kind of made up thing that they forged in medieval times. And so Michael Knowles says this is scandalous, even for some religious people who want religion to be an abstract thing. And we're going to go ahead and watch this in its entirety. I'll probably stop it at a few points to clear things up.
This is from Italy's Institute of Crystallography of the National Research Council. Scientists have just conducted a study on the Shroud of Turin. For those of you who don't know what the Shroud of Turin is, the Shroud of Turin is the purported burial cloth of our Lord, of Jesus. And the burial cloth appeared for the first time in public around the 14th century. So skeptics have said for a long time, this is a medieval forgery. This is not really from antiquity. This is not really the cloth that Christ was wrapped in after he was taken down from the cross. You read in the Bible that Joseph of Arimathea, who had this big tomb, wrapped Jesus in this cloth, and he was buried and entombed. And then he's resurrected. So skeptics don't know how to explain this shroud. What's odd about the shroud, though, is there is this faint image of a man on there, but it doesn't appear to be paint. There does appear to be maybe a little bit of blood, but it's not all blood. What's even stranger is the image that's on the shroud appears to be a photographic negative of the image of a man somewhere between 5'7" and 6 feet tall, a man who appears to have been tortured, a man who appears to have a crown of thorns on his head, a man who appears to have been crucified.
We'll stop him right here because I want to actually add this in. That negative imagery that he's talking about, the way that it's kind of imprinted on this cloth, one of the points that Timotheeology points out, it's like this is one of the biggest reasons why it wouldn't be a medieval forgery, because like the technology for such things just like wouldn't have existed. Like how would they have known predating photographs? And then the second thing too is, I don't know if Michael Knowles gets into this, But I also saw in a long thread from Timotheeology that the reason why they believe this imprint was there is it actually is very, very similar to what would have been a radioactive kind of burst that would have left that kind of energy that would have imprinted upon the exact kind of imagery that we see on the Shroud of Turin. But I'll let him continue.
But it's a photographic negative, as if it were produced by a spurt of light rather than paints or anything like that. And no one's known what this is. If it is, I mean, as it is, something akin to a photographic negative, no one can really understand how that would have appeared, even if it were a medieval forgery from the 14th century. Well, we didn't have photography back then. What is this thing? So in the 1980s, there was a study that used radiocarbon dating to test when the shroud was made. And in the 1980s, scientists concluded, it's from the Middle Ages. So it can't be the burial cloth of Christ because it's not from antiquity. This is a medieval forgery. And that's what most people know about the Shroud of Turin, if they know anything at all. However, there were always some questions about those studies. What part of the shroud were they testing? Was there any contamination, or was the radiocarbon dating precise? Well, now there's a new study that appears to be a little bit more precise. The study measured the natural aging of flax cellulose in the shroud and converted it to time since manufacture. So it studied 8 small samples of the fabric of the Shroud of Turin, put them under an X-ray, uncovered little details about the linens and the cellulose's structure and patterns, because the cellulose is made up of sugar molecules that break down over time. So you can reverse engineer this and figure out how old the garment is. And the study discovered that the shroud, the material of the shroud, has measurements that are analogous with samples whose dating, according to historical records, goes back to the 1st century. It's analogous to samples that they have from 55 to 74 AD. So almost precisely at the crucifixion.
If I'm correct, 74 AD, I believe, is the date that is allocated to when Jesus was crucified. I could be wrong on that. I do know in 70 AD is when the temple was crushed, or I guess smited, rather. Again, a lot of this also kind of picks up on that hint from the young Earth creationists in those theories that kind of revolve around the fact with how carbon dating is seemingly very not ineffective. And in fact, all other kind of dating methods that we have, such as I think it's rings on trees, and I could be wrong about this, but some of the other kind of ubiquitous forms of measuring and dating objects and materials align up with a 5,000-year-old kind of Earth, or a little bit longer than that, or shorter than that. And so, to speak to that too, with this carbon dating being wrong, I think maybe it's not even wrong, but maybe it's more so that carbon dating has such a Swiss cheese kind of model to it that it can be kind of applied in ways that is very misleading.
Now, the team also compared the Shroud of Turin with linen samples from the Middle Ages, from the 13th and 14th century, when, according to the 1988 study, the shroud was supposedly forged. However, the samples didn't match. They were totally different. So it couldn't have been from the 13th or 14th century, has to have been from the 1st century, it has to have been, well, pretty much from exactly the moment that our Lord was crucified. So why was the 1988 study wrong? Well, according to lead author of this study, Dr. Liberato De Caro, he said that the fabric samples are usually subject to all kinds of contamination, which cannot be completely removed from the dated specimen. So, for instance, if the cleaning procedure of the sample is not thoroughly performed, the carbon-14 dating is not reliable. So the numbers are this is just a much more precise mode of dating. And it turns out, from the latest scientific study, the Shroud of Turin appears to be the sort of shroud that could have been the shroud of Jesus. I mention this whole story because I really like the Shroud of Turin, but because this is really scandalous for people. If you talk to a normie on the street, some agnostic, some atheist, you say, hey, what do you think about the Shroud of Turin, which is the image of which is totally inexplicable from contemporary technological advancements, at the time that it was seems to have been made, and which dates back to antiquity and which purports to be the burial shroud of Christ.
And I think he's going to pick up on something here too, which is what better time for this discovery to kind of be made and be put into the mainstream than a period of time in which we are, at least in our society and even across the globe, is becoming entirely degenerate in nature, that you would thus then have God and Jesus, our Lord, to be revealing himself in much more profound ways. Now, I'm sure, scandalous is one way to put it, but I'm sure this will still be met with bunches and bunches of criticism. But I think it also goes alongside with when they found, the Ark back in Turkey. I believe this is about almost like 20 or 30 years ago at this point. And maybe it marks the fact that we truly are getting closer to a period of time in which it will be much more known to be good versus evil. At least that's, I guess, the way I'm viewing it. But again, it is something, and I think it should be something that I think even your average Christian should at least know and be aware of. And then also a great thing to bring up to people who maybe don't believe, to give them some insight into just how real this stuff is, as much as he said in his tweet, which is a lot of people just want, even those who believe, want a lot of this to just simply be an abstraction.
They would laugh at you. They'd say, "Oh, that's ridiculous. It was just made up." Whenever it first appeared on the public scene, it was just made up. It's all fake. These relics, they're all fake. The whole thing, it's all just like total nonsense, superstition, legends. But then you show them this study. You say, "No, it's from antiquity. Whatever it is, it's from antiquity." And the image is a photographic negative. And we don't, how do you explain it? That's scandalous to people. It's scandalous even to some religious people. There are some people who would call themselves Christians who would say, "Oh, I don't believe in that Shroud of Turin. That's crazy. I don't believe in something like the tilma of Our Lady of Guadalupe. This was a Marian apparition in America. This was a miraculous image, appeared on a cloth that was worn by a peasant 500 years ago. This cloth should have broken down within 30, 40 years. It's still intact. Anarchists in the early 20th century tried to blow this thing up. They blew up the church. They didn't destroy this delicate shroud. In fact, there was a crucifix that was bent around it as if to protect it. The image that miraculously appeared, no one really knows what the image is made of. And there was a microscopic analysis done on the eyes. So it's this image of Our Lady. It's this image of Mary. And it's an image, the microscopic study looked in at the lens of the eye in the image and found out that the lens of the eye contours exactly as a human eye. And there's actually an image in the lens of the eye, which is the reflection of the room, apparently, when the shroud was when the tilma was shown. Things like the Shroud of Turin, things like the tilma of Our Lady of Guadalupe are really scandalous to people, and even to religious people, because they say, no, religion's an abstract thing. It's not about this cloth. It's not about this thing that happened at this date. It reminds me of 1 Corinthians. It says, "For both the Jews require signs, and the Greeks seek after wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, unto the Jews indeed a stumbling block, and unto the Gentiles foolishness, but unto them that are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men." When you read a study like this and you say, "Oh, wow, this actually might be the miraculous burial shroud of Christ." In fact, that seems to be the most logical conclusion of what this is. Or the tilma. This seems to just be a miraculous image, because no one else can really explain it any other way. That seems to be the simplest explanation for it and the most persuasive. Then you start to think, oh, yikes, it might all be true. The claims that God makes in the Bible, the claims that the church makes, the guidelines that God has set down and that the church promotes.
That kind of very realized epiphany of fear of like, wait a minute. If that's true, it's like, where do you go from there? Especially for someone who may be agnostic, who may be atheist, right? Especially people who kind of beat the table and are like, I will not believe unless he shows himself, right? I won't believe, and they do it in these manners, or like, they kind of essentially kind of test God. Like, if you're real, move that flashlight across the room, things of that nature. I think he's spot on here, and I think it's even going to speak to people who are in the religion already. who kind of hold these kind of more cultural Christian positions and give less credence to the actual literal nature of what these things are. And I'm glad Michael Knowles picked it up, but I'll go ahead and let this play out.
Do this, don't do this. God saying, I want to be worshiped in this way and you want to live in this way. Golly, that might all be true. That is scandalous to people. That's scary to some people. That religion might not just be something floating around in your head, a matter of personal preference. There might be a right answer. And there might be a right way for you to live. And you might be called upon to use your reason, which is a distinguishing feature that reveals us to be made in the image and likeness of God. You might be required to use your reason to open your heart to faith and revelation and live in the right way so that you can know your God and you can flourish. And you might actually be convinced of that or brought along the path to being convinced of that by things like a really old shroud. Yikes, maybe it's all real.
I think that's a great way to put it. And that will be the end of everything I did have to cover for today. Probably a little bit less than what I normally would have, just because I was no power. And then I had to get what was it called? I had to get I want to get a couple more videos off the ground as well and start pumping those too and get a couple more in. It says, oh my, 8 viewers. Yeah. Hopefully we can build from there though. And I do want to say thank you for everybody who came in and chatted as well. Donnie, Kukla, Just a Guy, Knights of Gideon, everybody else.